Hey everybody, I thought I would do the screencast here. It might catch us up a little bit and get things all in for the semester, which I believe this will help. So we have done, we still have yet to do the rest of the muscles to the hip joint. I recognize that, but we have done the pelvis, the femur, the hip joint, and those muscles related to the pelvis that rotators and so forth. So before I do the muscles of the thigh, I'm going to do the bones of the leg and foot because a lot of thigh muscles actually find attachment on the upper leg. So by doing these first, I think it will help quite a bit. So I'm going to do this, and then that will have the knee as well, and then the muscles. So bones of the leg and foot. Remember that the upper leg is known as the thigh, and below the femur to the ankle is the leg proper. So the leg actually represents from the knee to the ankle. And this leg is made up of two bones, the tibia and the fibula, and it's somewhat similar to what you see in the forearm with the radius and ulna. We have two bones there with the syndesmosis in between, and same kind of idea, just that this is just built a little bit differently. And obviously we don't get supination pronation in the foot like we do in the hand, so the relationship between the tibia and the fibula are a little bit different. So proximally, when we look at the tibia represents the medial aspect of the leg. This is the sort of runs from the knee down towards the ankle joint, and it is on the medial side. Proximally, there is a medial and lateral condyle that is there to articulate with the medial and lateral condyles of the distal femur. So we can see here that we have, if we remember the distal femur, we have the two knuckles, the two condyles with the space in between. The proximal tibia here is set up in such a way to accept or receive those condyles, both medially and laterally, from the distal femur. The lateral condyle finds the fibular articular facet posterolaterally on its inferior aspect for the head of the fibula. So we can see here in the diagram on the right, the tibia represents the medial aspect here, and the fibula, which we'll be doing shortly, represents the lateral aspect. And we can see that there is an articulation between the proximal fibula and the proximal tibia, and the distal fibula and the distal tibia. Again, like we sort of saw similarly to some degree in the forearm. So we're saying here again that there is on the lateral condyle a fibular articular facet. So we can sort of see it drawn here in the light blue, and here from the posterior aspect as well. We can see where the head of the fibula does articulate to create the proximal tibiofibular joint that we can see here, and you can kind of see it here in this diagram as well. The two condyles together, if you look at them distinctly different in comparison to the distal femur, obviously the two condyles are quite convex in nature, and yet we can see here in the proximal tibia, it's actually a shelf. It actually is like a tabletop. It's quite flat. It's not that concave to accept the convexity of the distal femur. And there is something that we're going to discover here when we do the knee joint that helps make this congruency a bit better, but it is actually quite flat on the top. So we say that the two condyles make up the superior surface, which is known as the tibial plateau. And the reason for the term plateau is because it is relatively flat at the most proximal aspect. Between those medial and lateral condyles is this intercondylar eminence that we can see here. Two tubercles that rise up from the plateau, which we can see here. So between the medial and lateral condyles on the superior surface is the intercondylar eminence. And the intercondylar eminence represents both the medial and the lateral intercondylar tubercles, which you can see here on top. And if you happen to have your bone with you from your skeleton, they're quite obvious there. And we're going to discover that a very large pair of ligaments actually attaches here. And we'll get back to that when we get to the knee. This eminence, though, what's interesting, the other reason for the intercondylar fossa, right? Remember that fossa that existed between the two condyles of the distal femur, there was a big open space there. Well, this fossa between the two condyles accepts this intercondylar tubercle, so it allows it to fit in between when we bring the two together, and the space of the intercondylar fossa fits or allows the intercondylar eminence to sit between the two distal condyles of the femur. Approximately on the posteromedial surface is the roughened area for the attachment of semimembranosus. So the posteromedial here, we can see here that it's in this area here that we're talking about. The tibial borders. So first we have the lateral border, and this is known as the interosseous border. So we have to recognize that because the tibia lies medial, there is a space between the lateral aspect of the tibia and the medial aspect of the fibula. So we say here the lateral portion is the interosseous border, and this is the area for the attachment of the interosseous membrane. And of course, this connects the tibia to the fibula that you can see here in the diagram in gray from both views. And as I said earlier, this membrane is a syndesmosis, exactly the same as what we saw between the radius and the ulna in the forearm, okay? The membrane, as I said, it separates the extensors and the flexors. So when we look at this interosseous border, any muscles that attach anterior to this interosseous membrane, anterior, they are flexors, and any muscles that originate from the posterior interosseous membranes, those are flexors. Okay, extensors anteriorly and flexors posteriorly. When we look at the proximal posterior lateral surface, just inferior to the lateral condyle, as I said, is a facet for the articulation of the proximal fibula. So when we look here, we talked about how there is an articulation on the proximal tibia here for the fibular head. Well, of course, because we have a joint here, and it is a synovial joint, we do have a surface on the fibular head that will articulate along with the surface of the lateral condyle. We can see it a bit better here in this picture. So we can see here is the articular surface of the proximal fibula on the head, and we can see that there's the articular surface here on the proximal lateral aspect of the tibia. And together they form the proximal tibiofibular joint. The anterior border, so that was, of course, the lateral border. The anterior border is the most prominent, and that's what you can feel right under your skin, that really sharp edge that sits just under the skin anteriorly. And therefore, because it's just under the skin, we do say it's the most superficial portion of the tibia. It is thinnest at the junction of the middle and distal thirds. So we can see here, it's thinnest in here, and you can see just how sharp it is as it runs through. It is considered to be, at the proximal portion just below the condyles, we find something called the tibial tuberosity, which is right here. And that tibial tuberosity is highly palpable. You may have done it in lab, you may not have, but you will be if you haven't. And you can feel it it's quite protuberant. And this is the attachment for what's called the patella ligament or the quadriceps tendon, depending on the author of the book you're looking at. So as the quadriceps come down from, in some cases, all the way from the pelvic bone, it passes the knee, the quad groove passes the knee, and it attaches onto the patella, the tibial tuberosity. And if we remember that the patella sits within that tendinous material, and it is below if you remember me talking in class last week, this material, some authors say that below the patella is called the patella ligament, and some don't call it that. And you can see in this diagram the author or the artist has. But this, again, is the tibial tuberosity. It is considered to be approximately 5 centimeters inferior to the apex of the patella. And as I said earlier, this is the distal attachment for the quadriceps group. Now, on the medial aspect of the tibia, we've already discussed this when we were looking at sartorius, for example, and gracilis. On the medial aspect of the superior 1/4 of the tibia is found this area called the pes anserine. That should be an S, not a Z. This is the site for the attachment, of course, as we talked before, from lateral to medial. Sartorius, gracilis, and semitendinosus serve Grace T, and we can see it in this area right here. So here again, this is our plateau. Here is your lateral condyle and your medial condyle, and then we've got the tibial tuberosity here. On the tibia, we've got the part that it articulates with the fibular head as well, and then our pes anserines here on the medial aspect. And you can see it here as well in the diagram that this is sort of where it attaches from on that aspect. The posterior part of the tibia at the proximal part is a diagonal ridge called the soleal line. So we can see the soleo line here. There's a muscle here called soleus that attaches to it. And you're starting to see some similarities to what we saw some lines in the proximal femur. This is sort of the same idea. So you can see here in this diagram, the soleo line is here running on the posterior aspect. And as I said, is the attachment for the soleus muscle. Running inferiorly from the middle of the soleo line is called the vertical line, and we can see the vertical line running here, and it's sort of a little line that runs down here like this. And that vertical line is another attachment we'll get back to a bit later. It's a smaller one. Also on the posterior border, we find something called a nutrient foramen, which is a small little hole here. And this is where the model, when this bone was inside mom and was just cartilaginous in nature, if you remember our bone formation from last semester, this is the point where the artery penetrated into the chondral, shall we say, model, where then ossification started to occur, and that artery is maintained and stays in this bone to feed this part of the bone and the cells within it. Now the distal tibia is a bit different. Obviously the proximal portion is for articulation and muscle attachments as well, which we just went through, but the proximal portion of the tibia is where we find the articulation of the distal femur with the proximal tibia. The distal portion has its own articulations, but we'll get to that in just a moment. So the distal portion of the tibia is smaller than the proximal portion, so it gets a bit smaller as you work your way down. And there are two facets at the distal end. There is a facet for articulation with the distal fibula. So now we have a proximal articulation between the fibula and the tibia. And now we have a distal articulation between the fibula and the tibia. The other thing you have here is a part that gets a bit lower on the medial side, and this is a facet that allows for the articulation of a bone that's involved in the ankle joint called the talus. So here we can see we've got the distal tibia here. This has been cut away a bit. The distal fibula has been cut away, and you can see there's a ligament here that would have the articulation between the fibula and the tibia here distally. It is intact here that you can see. And then you have this other side here on the inside. So on the tibia being on the medial aspect of the leg, on the distal lateral surface here of this area, we have a smooth facet here to articulate here with this drawn in white area called the talus. In this area here, you can see the talus has been removed, and you can see the facet that's here on the tibia. There is also an inferior directed projection on the distal inferior portion of the tibia, and this is known as the medial malleolus. So this is on the medial side of the distal tibia, and you can see it right here. And you can even palpate it on yourself. When you work your way down, it's sort of that large protuberance just under the skin that sort of represents the ankle joint. And this is known as the medial malleolus. There is a notch at the distal portion of the medial malleolus, and this is the attachment for an extremely powerful ligament called the deltoid ligament. And that is called deltoid because of its shape. So you can see it kind of hanging down here a little bit in this drawing, and you can see that it's been cut here and hanging down here. And we'll get into this ligament a lot more when we talk about the ankle joint itself, but at least you can see it here, and it's off of that medial malleolus. So we say we have this a notch for this deltoid ligament. Now this medial malleolus sort of acts as a pulley system, and you can see here, and we'll get to this again a little bit later, but this is just an introduction. We can see that here is the medial malleolus here in this drawing. We can see it here as well. We can take note that posterior to the medial malleolus, there are quite a lot of structures, tendons, nerves, and blood vessels and lymph that actually pass posterior to the medial malleolus. We can see there's a fair amount of stuff that uses this medial malleolus as a pulley. So we say that there are two grooves on this distal medial malleolus. One is a groove for a muscle called tibialis posterior. So here's the posterior tibial tendon, which is related to tibialis posterior, and you can see it using its own groove there. The other one is a groove for a muscle called flexor hallucis longus, or, because sometimes it's in the groove and sometimes it's not, flexor digitorum longus. So we can see here is flexor digitorum longus that we can see here. And flexor hallucis longus is here. To let you know, when we were in the hand, pollicis means thumb, hallucis means great toe. Okay? Pollicis is thumb and hallucis means great toe. But again, you can see the malleolus gets used as a, sorry, I've lost my cursor. Here we go. The malleolus gets used as a pulley, which and has grooves on it, which takes into account these tendons and provides stability as they pass behind the medial malleolus to head out towards the foot. So the tibia was on the medial aspect of the leg. The other bone related here is on the lateral aspect of the leg, and that is known as the fibula. Interestingly enough, this is a primary place for muscle attachments, but it does not weight bear. So it's interesting that if it fractures, you don't weight bear on it. You can actually walk around with a broken fibula because the tibia is the one that does all the weight bearing. So it's primarily for muscle attachments and has no function in weight bearing. The fibula, along with the interosseous membrane, of course, allows the tibia to withstand some twisting and bending. So again, we can see here in the diagram, here we've got the medial tibia, and on its lateral surface, we have the osseous surface, which is the attachment for the interosseous membrane. And then on the fibula, on its medial surface, we have the same thing happening. We have an osseous surface on it that attaches to the lateral aspect of the interosseous membrane, okay? So we say the fibula along with the interosseous membrane allows the tibia to withstand some twisting and bending. At the proximal portion of the fibula, we find the head. And we can see here on the top already that nice shiny blue area. Of course, that's where it's going to articulate with the proximal tibia, right? To form the proximal tibiofibular joint. So this is the head of the fibula here, the most proximal part. And as I say here, at the medial surface of the head is a facet for articulation with the proximal lateral surface of the tibia. Now the head actually comes to a point, and you can kind of see it here in this drawing. And this head, this very point is known as the apex. And there's a muscle, a very important muscle that attaches here, and it's one of the hamstring group, and it is called biceps femoris. So there you go. You've got a two-headed muscle in the upper arm, biceps brachii. But you also have a two-headed muscle in the leg called biceps femoris, and we'll obviously get into that a little bit later when we're talking about the muscles. The other thing as well is the part of it is the attachment of the interosseous membrane. It too has a nutrient foramen on its posterior surface, about the middle 1/3. And as I said, the body of the fibula provides attachment for various muscles. Now, when we look at the distal aspect of the fibula, we said that the distal tibia gets smaller as it gets distal. The fibula gets larger as it goes distally, and it forms a large bump, shall we say it, known as the lateral malleolus. And we can see it here in this diagram at its distal part here. We can see here is the lateral malleolus, and it's on the lateral aspect. So that means we've got a distal tibiofibular joint between the medial aspect of the distal tibia, or fibula, sorry, with the lateral aspect of the distal tibia. What you can see here with the lateral malleolus, it actually drops down below the tibia here, and it sits on the lateral aspect of the head of the talus. So the lateral malleolus is more prominent on the posterior than on the medial malleolus. And again, if you just look at your ankle and you see the two bumps on the medial and lateral aspects, you can see that the lateral malleolus is much larger, and it also extends approximately 1 centimeter more distal as compared to the medial malleolus. On the medial side of the lateral malleolus, as I said, there is a facet for articulation with the lateral aspect of the talus, which is a bone very much associated with the ankle joint and the foot, and the tibia. The fossa of the lateral malleolus is found posterior to the articular area on the medial side. This is a groove as well for a muscle. So if we go back here for a moment and we see this diagram, we did have a groove on the medial malleolus that allowed these muscles and structures to pass behind it. We have the same thing on the distal fibula. We have, again, a groove here, which allows two muscles on the lateral aspect called fibularis longus and fibularis brevis. They use a groove as well, very similarly to the medial malleolus, as a pulley as the two muscles tendons move out into the foot. So we say the fossa of the lateral malleolus is found posterior to the articular area on the medial side, And this fossa is for attachment of the posterior talofibular ligament, as well as we have the peroneal groove behind it, which is for the peroneus longus and brevis. And you can kind of see it here just to some degree. The foot is our next one, and we've moved from the leg bones into the foot. There are 7 tarsus bones in the foot. There is the talus, which we've talked a little bit about recently here. We have another bone called the calcaneus. Then we have the navicular. Now, the navicular is kind of the twin to the scaphoid. In fact, in the past, the scaphoid wasn't called the scaphoid, which is the bone in the hand. It too is also called the navicular because they're both boat-shaped. But we moved to the scaphoid in the hand and the navicular in the foot. We also have a cuboid muscle. We then have 3 cuneiforms, 5 metatarsals, and of course we have phalanges. So there are some very strong similarities between the foot and the hand when we look at this. So this is just a diagram that we just talked about. So here is our calcaneus, here is our talus, our navicular, our cuboid, our 3 cuneiforms, our metatarsal bones, and our phalanges. And some similarities you can even see here. There's only 2 phalanges in the great toe, the hallux, and of course 3 in all the others, and very similar to the hand. And you can see it from this diagram as well, how they all sort of piece together. Here we can see the distal fibula, here's the distal tibia, and you can see they make a little bit of a square acceptance of the talus head. And when we get to the ankle joint, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So when we look at the foot, we have to understand that when we're walking or running, this joint needs to be extremely stable, otherwise we'd be falling all over the place. So the foot's stability and lack of movement, because if we compare the foot to the hand, obviously the hand is a far more diverse and greater amount of range of motion than the foot does. So we need that stability. So we say that the foot's stability and lack of free movement is due to, first, the way the bones fit together. So they fit quite tightly together, and this is known as structural integrity. And the other part is as well, these bones that fit very well together are also held very strongly in the position by strong ligaments. And we talked a bit about that when we looked at the hip, meaning that the hip had to be quite stable to take all that body weight and functionally allow us to stand and be stable. Well, the foot's the same way. In fact, as the forces travel more distally down the leg, the forces get much stronger even in the foot than they did in the hip. This also provides insertion for most leg muscles and foot muscles, helps maintain equilibrium. I'll show a little thing in class as to how the foot actually is working beyond anything you can imagine when we're walking or even standing. It is designed for locomotion, and it's also, which is one of the more important aspects of the foot, it is designed to uphold and disperse our body weight when we strike the ground when we're watching. So let's do the talus first. So you can see here we've got quite a number of bones. Actually, we'll go back to this picture here. Here is our talus that we can see here. It is the bone that does lie between the medial aspect of the lateral aspect of the medial malleolus and the medial aspect of the lateral malleolus. It's in this little square here, and you can see it kind of stands up like so. So the talus is the only bone of the foot that articulates with the leg bones, the tibia and fibula. It's the only one. It does rest on another bone called the calcaneus, which you can see here. So here's our distal tibia and fibula. Here's our talus. Here's our calcaneus, and you can see how the talus lies on the more anterior aspect of the calcaneus. So we say, oh, sorry, I went the wrong way with my mouse here. It rests on the supero-anterior 2/3 of the calcaneus. It articulates with the tibia superiorly, the fibular malleolus laterally, the tibio-malleolus medially, the calcaneus inferiorly, and the navicular anteriorly. So I'm just going to do a quick little drawing here. So just give me a moment. I'll pause here for a second, and we'll get this set up as soon as I can find there it is, my cursor. I have my little drawing box here. So I'm just going to change my colors just a bit here. There's my cursor. So let's go to red first. So if I draw the tibia, it kind of goes like so and up. If I draw the fibula, it comes down here, goes a little bit lower, and comes up accordingly. Okay, so here is our tibia. And here is our fibula. So you can see here we've got this big space between the two. So here is the lateral malleoli, and here is the medial malleoli and their associated bones. And we can see that there's a space here between the two. So we have a medial surface on the fibula, which I'll kind of just draw in blue. So that represents the medial surface of the fibula. And then we have the lateral surface of the tibia on the medial malleolus, but we also have articulating surface here on the distal tibia in the space in between. So we can see we've got a relatively large area for articulation here. So on the lateral malleolus, off of the medial malleolus, and off the tibia itself. So when we place the head of the talus in there, it actually fits like so. And you can see then we've got an articular surface here on the medial on the talus. We have an articular surface here on the talus, and we have an articular surface here on the talus. So you can see we have this large expanse here of articulation between the lateral malleolus and the talus, the tibia and the top of the talus, and the medial malleolus again on the medial aspect of the talus as well. So it all fits together. And when we get to the joints, this represents the true ankle joint, but we'll get back to that a bit later. So I'll come back to this again. So we can say the talus is the only bone of the foot that articulates with the leg bones, the tibia and the fibula. It rests on the superior anterior 2/3 of the calcaneus, and it articulates with the tibia superiorly, the fibular malleolus laterally, and the tibial malleolus medially, the calcaneus inferiorly, because it sits right on top of it, and just anterior to the talus we find the navicular. So here is we can see it here, the talus here in green. We can see how it sits on the lateral aspect of the calcaneus, which forms a joint there. I just drew what the head does between the fibula, the tibia, and then we can see here is the navicular here, anterior to the talus right here. So this is the navicular bone here. It is firmly held in place between the tibia and fibula, as you saw, and that articulation that I showed you, so we say this articulation between the tibia, fibula, and talus is actually called the ankle mortise joint. And again, we'll get into it a bit more when we actually do the joint, but understand that it's very strong, very powerful, and it is what is known as the true ankle joint. So things like eversion and inversion in the foot don't occur at this ankle joint, but we'll talk about that when we get to the joints. This is the only joint that allows for plantar and dorsiflexion, and that's a movement along the sagittal plane. So when the foot is doing either plantar, and that should be an AR, not an ER, if the foot's either doing plantar movement or dorsiflexion, it is only occurring at this ankle mortise joint, which is, of course, is what I just drew for you, and you can sort of suppose from that. Now, the part that we looked at here when I was drawing was we had, this represented the head of the talus, and you can see this whole thing comes together and makes this mortise. And if anybody's here done any bricklaying, you'll know what that means. If not, it's okay. I'll be discussing it in class. So the talus is divided into 3 parts. It has a head, a neck, and a body. So here's the head here with the navicular. Here's the neck just behind it, and then the body with the articular part between the fibula and the tibia. So the head is the most distal part of the talus. There are 3 facets on it. There is one facet where it articulates with the navicular, And then it has two facets where it articulates with the calcaneus underneath. Remember, we had the head here is what articulates with the navicular that we can see here. And then we can see how there are, if we were to flip the talus upside down, and I don't think I have it, no. But you can see slightly under here in the picture, you got a bit of gray here and a bit of gray here. These are what we talked about, the two facets for the calcaneus. So one for the navicular that we can see here, and 1, 2 to articulate with that anterior superior part of the calcaneus, okay? Now the medial facet of the 2 for the calcaneus, it articulates on the calcaneus at a point of projection of the calcaneus called the sustenaculum tali. So you can see it sticking out here. What I want you to understand, this is kind of like a tabletop. So the calcaneus, you can probably make it out to some degree in the drawings here. The calcaneus is quite narrow. And to zero you in here, this represents your heel. So this big knob here in the back, that's your heel, okay? So this is quite narrow in here. But you can see that the talus is quite wide here at the body. Looking down through the top of the articular part here, you can see it's quite wide, and you can see the calcaneus is quite narrow. So you have a projection of the calcaneus that comes out here, and that projection is known as the sustenaculum tali, and it widens the superior aspect of the calcaneus, which provides a tabletop or a shelf for the talus to sit on. And in this view, you can see it quite nicely. It allows for it to sit out here. So you can see it here in this drawing, but you can also make it out here. Here's the sustenaculum tali here. You can see it. It projects out quite a bit from the calcaneus here, again, providing a tabletop or shelf for the talus to sit on, okay? The neck, of course, lies between the head and the body. And under the neck, you actually have an area that creates a deep groove, and this deep groove runs between the talus superiorly and the calcaneus inferiorly. So we say inferiorly, there is a deep groove for what is called the sinus tarsi, so the opening of the tarsi, or the talus. And it attaches to the interosseous ligaments between the talus and the calcaneus. So to provide significant support, and again, we'll talk a lot about this when we get to the ankle joint itself. There's actually a hole just under here. And, similar to what we sort of looked at for interosseous ligaments in the sacroiliac joint last semester, this is kind of the same thing. You have a bit of a space between the two bones with very short, powerful ligamentous material that runs in that hole there. So again, inferiorly, there's a deep groove for the sinus tarsi, and we're talking about underneath the neck of the talus, which attaches to the interosseous ligaments between the talus and the calcaneus. The body lies posterior to the neck. It is more narrow posteriorly, and as I said, it has 3 facets as well. It has a superior facet that articulates with the inferior surface of the tibia by the convex trochlea of the talus. So we can see here, this big articular part here is the trochlea of the talus at the top. Here's the here we are looking here, okay? And then we have the facet on the medial surface to articulate with the lateral surface of the tibia, and a facet on the lateral surface to articulate with the medial fibula. So again, if we go back to the drawing here, we can see here our 3 parts here. So I'll just go here again I won't enlarge it. But I will say here that we've got the superior facet articulates with the inferior surface of the tibia via the convex trochlea. So this up here on the top would represent the trochlea here at the top. And then, of course, you have one part of it that articulates with the lateral aspect of the medial malleolus, and the other part that articulates with the medial aspect of the lateral malleolus. So again, superior facet that articulates with the inferior surface of the tibia via the convex trochlea, a facet on the medial surface to articulate with the lateral surface of the tibia, and a facet on the lateral surface to articulate with the medial fibula. Posterior to the trochlea, there's a groove, and it is separated by 2 tubercles known as the medial and or lateral tubercles of the posterior process of the talus. So here's your medial tubercle here on the posterior aspect, and here's your lateral here. So you can see there's the posterior process here, but in this drawing he hasn't divided it, but this one we can see it. Together again, this is the posterior process of the talus. We have the medial tubercle and the lateral tubercle, and you can note that there again, there's another groove in here which allows a muscle tendon to go through. And that is known, that muscle's tendon, the muscle is known as flexor hallucis. Remember, hallucis means great toe. So the tendon of flexor hallucis passes through this groove. So not only do we have the medial malleolus that works as a pulley, we also have this groove that's on the posterior aspect of the talus. It too works as a pulley as well, because reality is this flexor hallucis needs to get down to the bottom of the foot under here and travel all the way to the great toe. So it travels through this groove here, under the cestanaculum tali, all the way to the great toe. That is flexor hallucis. Next bone is the calcaneus, and of course, as I said, that's the heel bone. It is the largest and strongest in the foot. And of course, every time you heel strike when you're walking, this is the bone that transmits most of the stress from the talus to the ground as the body weight carries through the foot. And it does lie inferior to the talus. We've already looked at a couple of articulations there. And of course, it has a superior facet to articulate with the talus. It also has an anterior facet for articulation with a bone called the cuboid, which runs anterior to it. And as we said, the cestanaculum tali projects medially from the medial superior surface, which helps support the talus. And also, as I just pointed out to you, under the cestanaculum tali is a continuation of a groove for flexor hallucis longus. So we can see we have the groove under here, under the posterior process, that continues under the cestanaculum tali. So here we've got, we can see here's our posterior surface here. We can see the sort of the whole calcaneus kind of sitting by itself, and we can see it here all together. On the lateral surface, there is a ridge, and this is known as the fibular or the peroneal trochlea. There's two muscles that run down the lateral aspect from the fibula. These two muscles actually attach on the fibula, and they travel down, and they need to make basically a 90-degree turn to get out to the foot. They both travel fairly close to each other all the way down. But when they get to this fibular trochlea, the body utilizes that trochlea to separate the two muscles. So we can see here is the fibular trochlea we can see here, right? Longus is going to go under and head off to the more distal to the foot, and brevis is going to travel over top of the trochlea and head out to the fifth toe. So again, it separates the tendons of peroneus longus and peroneus brevis. Posteriorly is a prominence known as the calcaneal tuberosity, and it has a medial, lateral, and lateral prominence on each side. So on you can see kind of here, we have a bit of a medial and lateral process here on the posterior aspect of this. And there we find sort of a tuberosity that's roughened, and this is where, sort of inferiorly, so we have the calcaneal tuberosity, and then underneath that tuberosity, sort of more almost towards, we'd say, the more plantar surface, you have a roughened area, and this is for the attachment of the most powerful tendon in the body, and that is called the tendocalcaneal ligament, and you know it as the Achilles tendon. And you can see it sort of attaching here, which you can sort of see underneath here, right here. So our next bone, we can see here, so we just look at the diagrams here, we've done the talus, which is right here, and we've done the calcaneus here. Now we're going to do the navicular, and as we learned, the talus does directly articulate with the navicular at the head, okay? So the navicular, as I said, used to be called the scaphoid. It lies between the head of the talus proximally and the three cuneiforms anteriorly. So we can see here, here is your talus. Here's the head with the articulation with the navicular. So the navicular articulates with the head of the talus proximally, and you can see how it articulates with three bones here called the cuneiform bones that we can see across here. Okay, so again, it's on. Sorry. Oh yeah, the three cuneiforms. It is on the medial surface. Oh, we also find something called a navicular tuberosity. which is considered to be a landmark of the foot, and you may have already palpated it. If you haven't, you for sure will be very shortly. And this navicular tuberosity is actually the attachment for a muscle called tibialis posterior. And every once in a while, the navicular will articulate with the cuboid that you can see here. So once in a while, you get a bit of an articulation here. You can sometimes, and it doesn't matter. I won't be asking questions on it, but just understand it can happen. So here in this diagram, here we go. Here is the talus. Here's the neck. Here's the head with the articular surface. And the articular surface of the head articulates with the proximal portion of the navicular that we see here. And then the distal portion of the navicular articulates with cuneiform 1, 2, and 3, and occasionally here with the cuboid, which is our next bone. So the cuboid articulates with the calcaneus posteriorly and the 4th and 5th metatarsals. And it does, as I said, sometimes articulate with the navicular. It is the most lateral in the distal row of the tarsus. So the cuboid is here, the most lateral of the medial aspect. So we've got our cuneiform here, and here's our cuboid here. Remember, this is medial here, great toe. This is lateral here, little toe. Okay. So again, it's the most lateral in the distal row of tarsus. And on the inferior surface is found the tuberosity of the cuboid, which we can kind of see right here. And I think I have it here. Where are we here? I thought I saw it here. Here it is, right here. This part right here, okay? And that is on what we would call the plantar surface, okay? So the cuboid tuberosity is on the plantar surface. The book says inferior, but I want you to think of it more on the plantar surface. It'll make more sense. Anterior to that tuberosity on the lateral and inferior surface is a groove for the tendon of peroneus, of the peroneus muscle, peroneus longus. So we're going to learn that muscle as well. It's quite a unique muscle. It comes down the fibula. It gets separated by the fibular trochlea, which we just talked about here. And then longus literally goes all the way from the fibula. Now we're looking at the plantar surface. Comes underneath that the cuboid, follows that that groove all the way along, and crosses all the way over to the big toe. So it starts way over here on the fibula and crosses all the way over to the big toe. So we say anterior to the tuberosity, on the lateral and inferior surface is a groove for the tendon of peroneus longus. Next are the 3 cuneiforms. There are 3 of them, as I said. Medial is considered to be the first, intermediate the second, and lateral the third. So 1, 2, and 3. Okay? The medial is the largest and the intermediate is the smallest. The medial is the largest and the intermediate is the smallest. They articulate proximally with the navicular and distally with the 3 medial metatarsal bones. So here we can see, here is the navicular here where all 3 articulate, and then the most medial articulates with the first digit of the foot, the second articulates with the second, and the third articulates with the third. We can see it here. You can also see medial, intermediate, and lateral here in this diagram as well. They play, and then the lateral portion, of course, articulates with the cuboid that we see here. Right here is the articulation. These play a very important role. The reason we have 3 bones here is because they create what's called the transverse arch of the foot. And again, when we get a little further into the foot, we're going to discuss the arches that we find in the foot and the role they play. But these 3 bones help form that transverse arch. The metatarsals, they're just like the metacarpals. They're miniature long bones. They're numbered from medial to lateral in the anatomical position. So whereas the digits in the hand are numbered from lateral to medial, in the foot they're numbered from medial to lateral, with obviously the great toe as 1 and the little toe as 5 and all the way across. There are 5 in total, just like in the hand there are 5 fingers. They articulate proximally with the distal row of the tarsal bones and distally with the phalanges of the toe. Just like in the hand, they're divided into 3 parts. The base, which is the most proximal, the body, which is in the middle, and the head that is most distal that articulates with the phalanges. It's exactly the same as it is in the hand. It's just that we call it a metatarsal in the foot and a metacarpal in the hand. What's interesting is when we look at the sort of the way they're together, we see there's a direct, the base of number 1 of the first metatarsal articulates with the medial cuneiform, And the base of the third metatarsal articulates with the distal aspect of the third cuneiform. But you'll note here that between the first and the third, there's a bit of an indentation here, and the second gets buried into it. So we say the base of the second metatarsal is wedged between the medial and lateral cuneiform and the first and third metatarsals. So you can see that it's kind of wedged in here. And it's important to understand that within the context of this bone doesn't move much in here as compared to the others because of this wedging in. And this is a notorious joint and bone that can get microfractures in it. We call that a marching foot. So soldiers, for example, who march a lot, because this metatarsal doesn't move a whole lot, it can get microfractures in it. It's quite painful. Going the wrong way. The heads of the metatarsals bear the body weight when we step off. So when you think about, when your coach says, get in that athletic position and get up on the balls of your feet. When you're on the balls of your feet, you're actually standing on the heads of your metatarsals. The second, of course, is the longest and therefore under most strain. And the head of the first metatarsal articulates with the sesamoid bones of the first metatarsal. So in some diagrams, you'll see right here that there's two sesamoid bones here on the plantar surface of the first metatarsal for a particular muscle that heads off to the great toe. The phalanges are the most distal. There's 14 in total. Just like in the hand, the first digit has only 2 phalanges, a distal and a proximal. The other 4 have 3 each, a proximal, a middle, and a distal. The phalanges of the first are short and strong. So yes, you have both pips and dips in your hand and in your foot. Thanks for listening, and we'll move forward when we see each other on Friday. Thanks. Bye for now.